about what human rights are, what they mean in their everyday lives, not just the legal rules, but actually what does it mean? What does it mean to be treated with dignity and respect? And how does that help us live well together? And what are the responsibilities of those in power to make sure that that happens? And certainly in London, in the last few weeks, where we had our London date of our human rights tour, the conversation was very different to the one that you hear in Westminster. The conversation was about, actually, do you know what we do? A nation that often happens in Westminster, which is where those in power who have the responsibility to uphold those rights don't always...
Do you think we're going in the right direction? Are we going backwards in that respect?
I'd say that the Human Rights Act is probably the most important legislation passed in Britain since the Second World War. It gives every citizen, every resident, protection against an overbearing, intrusive state. The Human Rights Act says the state can do lots of things, but there are certain red lines. It can't torture people. It can't indiscriminately invade your privacy. It can't discriminate on the basis of who you are. Those are very important protections, and it would be absolutely disastrous if the Human Rights Act was repealed, because for the most part it has extended the rights and freedoms that people enjoy in this country, and particularly in London.
I mean, it's not just about maybe just the government that has to work against human rights, also as individuals, and that's indeed what you're doing. And when we had one Londoner very recently, she was imprisoned in Iran, recently just released, Gonche Ghavami. Do you think there is also maybe a pressure, is there more that we can do as individuals to go and help with human rights in other parts of the world?
Absolutely, and I think we have a role as individuals to join other people's fights for human rights across the world. But I also think that as individuals within the UK and within London, we also have to think about what does the question mean if some of our MPs and some of our representatives are talking about taking our human rights law away. What does that say about the message that we send internationally? What does that say to people who are imprisoned in Iran if we say, actually, we're not having human rights laws here?
And what about the way the government in our country work with other countries where the human rights record is not very good, say countries such as China? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, by all means we should be supporting the global effort to defend human rights everywhere, but we also need to look at ourselves. In the so-called war against terror, we have in this country, in many respects, cut away at some basic human rights. And I think the recent proposals from the government over dealing with people who've gone to Syria, there are aspects of those proposals which are clear infringements of human rights. We don't, of course, support terrorism. We want to stop terrorism. But on the other hand, we have to do so in a way that's consistent with the rule of law and respect for human rights. And to take away people's right to return to the country where they have citizenship or residence, that's a big, big step, which, apart from anything else, actually, in my view, it fuels and actually exacerbates extremism. It doesn't remedy it. So we have to be really, really careful. We want security against terrorism, but we mustn't erode freedom in the name of defending it.
Well, how do you propose police here tackle that? We have girls, young men flying out to Syria. We don't know why they're flying out exactly, and they want to come back. How do you propose that we deal with that then?
Well, I mean, the government's approach to the threat of terrorism has been very much about draconian penalties. The real way to deal with the terrorist threat is education, debate, to refute the ideas that terrorists and terrorist supporters espouse. So there are some fantastic Muslim advocates who represent the true face of Islam, of peace, justice, compassion, social solidarity. Those voices need to be heard more. We need to recognise that to combat extremism in the Muslim community or any community, we need people in those communities to take the lead. So they are the voices, they are the ones driving, because they will be listened to more seriously. And of course, at the end of the day, you defeat bad ideas with better ideas, and that's through education and debate. So the government needs to do much more about education and empowering community groups which are challenging these extremist views, rather than repressive legislation.
What do you say to that? Is that the way to tackle this issue?
Absolutely, and I think it's a much broader issue around education. I think the reality is that human rights are about not what divides us, but what unites us. They're the basic things that we all have and that we all share as human beings, irrespective of our other identities, our characteristics, other things in our life. And really, the focus needs to be on actually education and empowerment based on human rights, if we understood that and we understood the fact that actually we're all a member of the human family and that there are these values, these standards and these laws that unite all of us, then that would go a long way in tackling some of those issues. And I think it would also go a long way in tackling kind of misperceptions and ideas about human rights. Human rights has a really important role to play in terrorism and the fight against terrorism, but it also has a really important role to play here in London at tackling issues like sexual violence and the fact that sexual violence isn't dealt with properly. The John Warboys case, the black cab rapist, the women involved in that case actually used the Human Rights Act to hold the police to account for their failures in investigating that crime. So just as we look at human rights as being something that is about the global fight against terror and what that means here in the UK, we also have to turn the mirror inwards and think actually within our society here at home, human rights have a really important role to play in the way that we live with each other as well. And we can't just look outwards, we also have to look inwards.
So here in London, then, do you feel like human rights, we're the forefront of human rights in the capital here?
I think that there's a lot of really great activity that goes on in London. There's a lot of really good activism. There's a lot of people who are being vocal and who are standing up. But as with everything, nothing's perfect. And there's always more that we could be doing. And I think particularly now, as we're seeing these attacks against our human rights law and legislation and system here domestically, there's a lot more that we could be doing to be standing up and saying, well, actually, human rights matter. And they matter in the UK and they matter in London.
Do you think we're